will also join shortly.
Hi, guys.
Hi,
Ah, good, you can hear me.
we can hear you.
I can just hear you. Can everybody hear me? Or am I on mute? No, I'm here.
Yep, that's loud and clear.
Hi, Mr. Sutcliffe.
I'm good. How are you all? Haven't seen you for ages.
I still exist.
Still alive and kicking. Well done. I'm very pleased to hear that. Sure. Mr. Fatah, I have not seen you forever. Have you been gallivanting around the world, or you've been locked down for a little bit?
I'm in lockdown, but I'm going to Durban on Monday. Steve, you look younger than ever.
Are you driving, or?
Not a chance, not this time. There's no client I'm driving for this time. So just for the panelists while you're here, I know that we do have a few of the attendees already joined in. It's quite an informal hour, so it's not a panel discussion. I'm just going to reflect on some of our work, and before you know it, the hour will be done. And at various points, I will point to some of the panelists just to, for 5 minutes, share something about the work we've done. It's both for us internally and externally to reflect on work and on different sectors, and possibly to also think about next year. So it's more of a cafe. If you need to drop off after your question, or if you need to be asked a question first, you can pop out. We've had people last week popping in and then leaving and then grabbing a coffee, and then we're in the office as well, so there's telephones and people moving in and out. So this is not a formal panel discussion, but thanks very much for giving your time, and we'll start in a few minutes. Cape Town time.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm here for a little while. I do have some slides if you need me to go through anything. I just knocked a couple of things together, so I can use it, or we can just chat. Let's see how it goes. I'm totally relaxed.
Great.
Just not sure why I can't hear you all very well.
We are also broadcasting to Facebook, so people can actually also popping in on Facebook and Instagram live, so they don't have to log into the Zoom, which makes it much easier to reach more people. And it is also being recorded.
Awesome. Well done, Rashik.
So some people watch them afterwards, and not always live. So it will go out to our networks and followers as well. Apologies if there's a bit of noise in my background, but it is a live scenario here.
Okay, I think we'll start by playing the poem, and we'll begin our session.
Coding for Gogo began when she sculpted grand dreams onto pottery, crocheted algorithmic patterns onto garments that we grew into. This was the original digital technology, a reflection of our artistic expression. In a world as big as one's imagination, made smaller by tech, we're brought together by clouds and streams. For even networks know the strength of connectivity, as we do the power of human connection. Africans, our imagination ruled the world. By it, worlds advanced. New methods demand new forms, so we morphed. From mud huts to skyscrapers, from Morse code to binary code, where coding for girls is not sacrilegious, but said with the same simplicity as a makeup tutorial. Yes, a tomorrow where girls are lining coding like lining makeup, hacking bro codes, breaking barriers. Background has never birthed intelligence and talent, nor be they the DNA of privilege. If you can dream it, you can code it. Debug and refactor with every binary, not restricted by a mouse, keyboard, or data. Be it in a leafy suburb, downtown CBD, or the township. Creativity, your currency, your mind, a mine. With evolution, the tune never changes. We just dance to it differently. Memory is stored in feeling. This flow is innate. There is no mathematics to the sound. But we have always known this. Rhythm is more in action than in thought, and it's playing out than it's scripting. Some have called it mysticism. I call it the resurrection of our ancestors who art in heaven through our images of unborn things, our words, sensations, song and dance, an embrace of Urban Festival 2020, an embodiment of the ideal.
So yeah, usually we start the Urban Festival events this month long of virtual engagements with this spoken word of the poem by a poet called Emma, and she kindly produced a poem for every single week. So we're very lucky to have that amazing piece of work. And each Urban Festival event has to start with that poem. And I think this is the third or fourth iteration of the poem. Oh, sorry, the third poem. Because with virtual events, it's always very difficult to tie people together across an entire month of events. So those who aren't familiar with Urban Festival, if you go to urbanfestival.co, you'll see we're now halfway through a month of exhibitions and studios and talks. They're not all webinars and panel discussions. So the website has a full program, and this still is, as I check the dates, there still is 15 more days to go. On weekends, there are Instagram tours, and Sundays, there are film nights. So please check that out as well. For those who don't know, I'm Rashid Fattar. I'm the founder and director of Our Future Cities. Welcome to our third Lunch and Learn. The Urban Festival prompted us to reflect on Our Future Cities work in various areas or sectors. I particularly dislike sectors or areas because cities don't really function in departments, at least outside of the city of Cape Town itself or outside of government. And work really overflows from one area into the next. So the purpose was to talk to some of the people we've worked with, understand where we've come from, reflect on some projects. And then for those who are joining in as attendees, we have some of the individuals and organizations we've worked with before, who we will be talking to and asking questions about past projects and some of their points of view. You can use the Q&A function. You can also use the chat function. You can also tweet questions on Twitter, Facebook, and various platforms. Today we're focusing on, I suppose, an area that we call walkability, accessibility, and mobility. And this isn't just about transport and engineering, but for a long time, the sort of walkable environments for many people, the public realm, has been an afterthought. So you'd have quite a large development and a large spend on a project, but how people move through that space, the experience in that space, was not really something that anybody thought about. And so the in-between spaces, even in some of the most successful precincts financially in Cape Town and across South Africa, you really feel that the movement of anybody who doesn't have a car is really something which is just thought about on the side. I'll get the formalities underway by sharing a little bit of our work, what we, how we sort of have covered and approached work in this particular area or sector. Give me 1 second. This is a new computer, so of course there are technical difficulties. Give me 1 second. I think I'll just read it out. I don't think we need to share a presentation. I think I need to go to system preferences or something like that to go and change that. But this is also already on our website. So some of the areas and some of the kinds of work we'll be doing in the space is to observe and study how people and vehicles are moving, generating data and field reports to feed into, let's say, area-based projects. So at some points, manually counting people at different intersections in different areas, getting proper estimates of the flows and movements of pedestrians in particular. We have looked at walkability and the overall quality of the public realm, both on a precinct scale and on a sort of a metropolitan scale, developing really walkability and accessibility strategies, working closely with communities, urban designers, planners, and engineers, and that could range from a township setting to something in a city center. We've worked with both South African and international agencies to map some of the key stakeholders in the mobility sector. So it's often quite confusing who the different actors are in that space. We look a lot into the future of mobility trends and opportunities, in particular, some startups, but also some of the bigger questions around how, for example, public transport will be financed in the future, and whether it still makes sense for example, local government to actually build all the public transport themselves. And then with Accelerate Cape Town, who have joined us, we have looked into how other sectors could contribute to mobility challenges, in particular, the corporate sector. I think we'll go straight into some of the discussions. And Steve, I just want to start with yourself, who is looking into traffic modeling and traffic simulations and has been used in various small and big projects. So Steve, how have you been able to, I think we started working mainly on the City Lift foreshore proposal, but how have you brought together a sort of walkable environment with the kinds of work you do, which is focused very much on traffic? Is that easy to do, or are you constantly having to mediate between engineers and developers and communities? I know you have this incredible simulation, but we talk about walkable environments, and then pedestrians are really the afterthoughts, or the side effect, really, byproducts.
Yeah, it's an interesting environment, and I think along the way we've kind of forgotten that people are our target market. You know, we've been designing for motor cars for the past 30 or 40 years, and the shape of our cities is a result of that. The great thing about working with you guys is that it's a collaborative effort. You know, I don't have all the answers, and no one designer does. But we've got to start looking more in terms of what the city needs, what the community needs, and designing accordingly. You can argue that we shouldn't waste a good crisis. And I think the pandemic has been eye-opening for a lot of people. I hope the road authorities have been paying attention, but it's changed the way we think about mobility. We've been preaching ride sharing. We've been talking about alternative forms of mobility for a long time now, and suddenly we've all had to think about video conferencing as we're doing today. And the mobility demands out there on the street are not from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock in the morning. Hey, we can change our patterns. We can change our mobility needs, and for me, that's very exciting. Perhaps a stroke of reality is that I find we tend to live in two different cities. One is a public transport captive audience, and one is very much a middle class private transport consideration. And frankly, the problem that we've caused is that there isn't an alternative to sitting in one's warm car listening to the radio coming to work. And that's where we've got to change things. I would argue that we have enough infrastructure to go around. We have a robust road network. We don't need any more roads. We need vast improvements on our public transport, clearly. The railways, the demise of the railway has hurt Cape Town enormously. Of that, there is no doubt. But we can't afford to have single driver, single vehicles. That's the honest truth. We need to start sharing that space, and we need to start sharing our travel times and our mobility options. And the transportation sector is ready for disruption. It really is. There's a lot going on in the market. There's a lot of new technologies bursting forwards. And I think it's incumbent on the road authorities to facilitate that transition. And of course, in the private sector, and that's a delightful thing about events such as this in terms of collaborating. Yeah. We must push those ideas, and the more people that shout and make a noise, the road authorities must take notice. So hey, there's
Steve,
a whole
do you feel that the way you've been communicating, I know that you, for example, in those, I love those simulations that you do. Do you think that those tools have been effective, or we need maybe new tools? Because I think in some of them you've shown, for example, let's say Adley Street, where you can, if you shift the culture as you speak in terms of public transport, the problem doesn't start at the intersection, but you can do both at the same time. You can show people how everyone can be accommodated in space. And I think maybe we haven't done enough of a good enough communication job. We often look to other cities and say, we want that, but or have those visuals not really sunken in your presentations? Because I think whenever you want to change or close Darling streets, or we wanted to, in Durban, close one lane on Fada Road in each direction, everyone gets into traffic modeling mode and predicts the end of the world. Do we need new methods to communicate?
I think the methods are out there. We need new ways of thinking about the issues. And again, we've been designing for motor cars for the past 30, 40 years. And, pedestrians share that space, and there are often conflicts between vehicles and pedestrians. And don't get me wrong, pedestrians can be pretty aggressive out there as well. But we need to model those aspects, and we need to start asking the tough questions of how to make mobility safer, and that includes mobility on foot and mobility on a bicycle. And we're not very good at that. So that's where we need the new tools. We need to start evaluating what makes it safe and how we can improve matters. I'm less concerned about capacities and moving vehicles around, but more concerned about moving people and safety. And that should be paramount in any walkable, livable community space or a city.
Thanks, Steve. I'm just going to, now that I can share my screen and I have that capability, I'm going to reflect on some of our very early, like almost exploratory work which was in Mfuleni. By the way, this is all on our website. So I think I'm sharing the right, you should be seeing some blue routes. We would go to Mfuleni on the weekend, and it was around the time the Western Cape government was looking into the high street economy. But ultimately, I think it was around alcohol use and shebeens and formalizing that network. But there we went, and went in with some residents. And I think what was interesting to see, I think there are more visuals somewhere, but just the link to the taxi rank, which was moderately successful. The walking route was of a poor condition, despite there being City of Cape Town trading structures. It was a walkable neighborhood. If you went there I think we went there on a Sunday with some students. Yes, there were cars, but people felt very free on the streets. So I think this raised interesting questions around, around the quality of infrastructure. And we had entered into a competition, sort of a painted route, which would improve the quality of that route towards the taxi rank. And then over time discovered that there were more walking routes to consider stemming out from that. So if you could just start to improve people's daily experience to and from public transport. And that secondly, that, walkability was already embedded in that area. But linked to that, other insights are really about, for example, there was a petrol station which was about to go up, and the urbanists and everyone says, no, don't put that there. But that petrol station provided 24/7 security and an ATM people could use. I think at one point there was not a single ATM in the entire area. So I think when you speak about walkability and accessibility and mobility, there are actually so many, for lack of a better word, fingers and areas which one has to consider. It's not just public sector that creates safe spaces and walking routes. It's actually the existence of functioning private sector and shops. And for this area at that stage, I think this was about 8 or 9 years ago, the petrol station was quite an important part of bringing another layer of safety, even though it was perceived as being something for vehicles. If I reflect on another project, if you can see my screen on Florida Road in Durban, we actually looked at a number of ideas for the, it wasn't purely about reducing the number of traffic lanes, but there were, despite it being a really safe and walkable streets, you'd go long stretches without formalized crossings. And so we really looked at a number of more tactical interventions which could be included to bring the streets to life, actually to add more life. And in some places, for example, there'd be an apartment building, two apartment buildings, one with a massive fence wrapped around it and one without a fence. And so there were big differences in perceptions of safety on a very safe street. There was a church with a high fence around it. There were kids rollerblading outside the apartment block on the street. So what was meant to be sort of a street study actually became a more of a community study. And that's generally what happens when one gets into streets and mobility and walkability. I think the same could be said of a project in, let me just stop my screen. How do I do this? Stop share. In the Belleville CBD, when it became a lot about cultural groups and how informal traders and the various cultures from across South Africa and in particular Africa weren't presented with ways to incorporate their needs for trading and communication and movement in that area, but was simply there to exist. And the infrastructure planned, for example, Crisscroll Avenue was similar to the fan walk of Cape Town. There was no consideration that it was a different context, a different environment. So trees and brick paving was sort of the response to that sort of majority pedestrian route as well. I'd sort of like to segue and almost switch completely to, not completely, but to the Transport Project Office, which was a really great initiative by Accelerate Cape Town. Ryan, it's us urbanists, I say, really enjoy these discussions. And then when we first engage it almost felt like we had left out everyone else who was trying to do different things in terms of corporates and big companies. And I think there were about 12 at the time. And so we had almost left out those with the ability and the influence over large amounts of people to do something. I thought maybe you could just share why that was important for Accelerate Cape Town and why it was important to work together on bringing, I suppose, bringing more stakeholders into the action and the conversation around mobility.
Sure. I mean, we got involved in this initially because traffic congestion was obviously reaching completely unsustainable levels. It was starting to impact on productivity, and we have a lot of companies that work on sort of hour-based models and so on. You can't have your employees stuck in traffic for 4 hours a day. It's just not workable. And also, in addition to that, stressed employees, people getting to the office already stressed, having spent all that time in sort of your typical peak hour traffic, was just not productive at all. And then another interesting aspect was the cost of parking. So I'm not sure if people are aware of this, but many of the newer developments, parking bays come at an enormous cost, right? So parking has become quite a significant revenue stream for property developers. And so for all of these reasons, you had corporates starting to ask questions around what else could be done. And we felt it important to sort of say, well, what can corporates do? And how do we shift the responsibility for addressing all of this traffic congestion away from only the city, but start incorporating more players, as you rightfully mentioned. And many of these corporates are employing hundreds, if not thousands of people. And we felt that was quite a nice captive audience to start messaging. I think, the reality is we all accepted that a proper mass transit system and rail is probably the solution for Cape Town, but we're all also very aware that that's not going to happen in the short to medium term. And so it was necessary for companies to sort of get stuck in and do what they can to start chipping away at this problem. And we tried all kinds of things, carpooling apps which we developed to try and reduce the number of single occupancy vehicles on the road. Corporate shuttles to reduce just the total number of vehicles on the road. And this is a significant problem. I think, what our research had shown at that point was that close to 80% of all vehicles coming into the CBD are single occupancy vehicles. And the thinking was if you could get 2 people per car on average, you could make a significant impact and reduce the number of cars. And then, of course, non-motorized transport was of course something that we looked at and is becoming increasingly important. But it's an interesting space. What we found was that it really does need a holistic approach, and you kind of need everybody and as many people as possible to be involved in this, because what you're trying to effect is behavioral change, and in order to make that sustainable on large scale, you really need the support mechanisms and so on to sustain that. We found, for example, just a simple thing that when city leadership changed, all momentum was lost within many of those projects because you had new
understatement of the year, right?
Say again.
Understatement of the year.
Yeah, and so you have completely different visions, completely different ideas, and just a simple thing would be to have some sort of mechanism within cities that allow for continuity of these projects when leadership changes, and that the project and the initiative is not vested in sort of one individual who's passionate about this. I don't know if you want to talk about some of the findings and some of the things that we discovered and where we thought it could go better at this stage.
Yeah, I think that is useful because I think this year has changed everything. And, not only are there corporates...
That's the understatement of the year, I think.
Corporates and governments having to suddenly not just remote work, but think about whether or not they're coming back. Mobility and quality of the work environment and where that work environment is even more important. So I'm thinking it's now a good time to share those findings because they probably even hold more weights. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things we found was that what it really requires, if you want to effect long-term behavioral change, it needs constant communication, constant messaging. We found that, we would facilitate a workshop at each of these companies individually to introduce a carpooling app, generate some interest. And there would be an enormous amount of initial interest. It makes sense for people. But if you don't continue sort of messaging to them, that interest very quickly tapers off and everybody forgets about it, and they revert back to the usual pattern. So that was the one thing, was that, you really do need constant communication to be in their face, messaging around the benefits of this continuously. And we also found there are different levels of acceptance and understanding across corporates. And so it's a little bit of a misperception that you have this sort of homogenous corporate grouping where everybody thinks the same and has the same level of understanding. We found that incentives are absolutely critical to maintain positive behavioral change. So where the early adopters did sort of jump onto the app and start carpooling and so on, they didn't really see any benefits with respect to reduction in traffic congestion. And so, their lived reality didn't change at all, but yet they were making the sacrifice and giving up their car and giving up an element of freedom and mobility and so on. And unless you incentivize those people to continue doing that, they're just not going to continue doing it. And there were some very interesting models that emerged. And again, it speaks to the fact that corporates and companies think very differently. We had one company, for example, that said, well, absolutely not. We don't care how our staff get to the office. And whether they come with their cars or they use other forms of transport, we expect them here on time at their desks doing the jobs. The flip side of that is you had a company that said, well, we spend a fortune on parking bays. And so if you as an employee are willing to give up your parking bay, we'll give you a cash allowance every month to use on an alternative form of transport. And that's quite powerful, right? That's effective because it's money in your pocket that you hadn't seen before because you weren't even aware of the cost of a parking bay. And so that was quite a useful model. But again, those early adopters didn't see any benefits. And so unfortunately, they got punished. And we also found it absolutely critical to develop champions or ambassadors within the company. So companies have very powerful communication infrastructure internally within that company. And so if you can develop a senior champion within that company who's able to use that communication infrastructure, it becomes incredibly powerful where that company starts messaging and creates almost a culture within that company of using alternative transport.
I think, Ryan, that culture is also just trying new ideas, I suppose.
Absolutely. Yeah, and being willing to take a punt on something in the interest of the bigger picture, right? And then, of course, non-motorized infrastructure. I think this is absolutely true. A lot of people, particularly in a city like Cape Town, who cycle and would love to use their bicycles, but you have almost a sense that the city really needs to develop a safe, demarcated network of interconnected cycle routes, and you get the sense that what we have at the moment, despite some really good efforts, is a somewhat disjointed cycle infrastructure or bicycle infrastructure, which is almost an afterthought to the way the cities were built to actually support cars. And so you still have cyclists having to expose themselves to danger in traffic and so on. And in some instances, I'm not sure if it's been fixed since we did this project, but there were some instances where cycle lanes just come to a dead end, and you suddenly find yourself at an intersection having to now brake traffic, right? And so it really needs to be a dedicated, integrated cycle network that allows people to move around the city freely on bicycles without having to dodge minibus taxis and the like, and I think that would be quite good. And then I think on the flip side of that, the company responsibility is to create facilities at the office that support that kind of behavior. And we're finding that there are a few really nice examples of that. Deloitte, for example, are building a new headquarters at the V&A waterfront. And they're putting a very, very strong emphasis on non-motorized transport. And so they've made facilities available, lockers for bicycles, shower facilities, all those sorts of things, which I think is really important. And they've supplemented that with a very powerful communications program and to sort of really encourage staff to use non-motorized transport and so on. But maybe just to conclude, something you touched on is actually absolutely critical. There has been a fundamental shift in the way that people use offices now, thanks to COVID. And it's been really interesting, and I think it's going to be quite significant in a place like Cape Town, where, initially we sort of, everyone faced the shock of, we can't go to the office, we've got to work from home, what does this mean? Many companies responded quite positively by getting their staff set up to work from home, getting them the infrastructure, the connectivity, and so on at home. And having made that investment, we actually finding that productivity has not suffered at all. Staff are much happier, much prefer the time freedom and the work from home sort of model. And companies are realizing enormous efficiencies where suddenly they're all realizing we don't need these massive offices anymore. We don't need all this glass and steel that costs a fortune. When our employees are far happier and more productive working from home. And so I think where we've gotten to now is sort of a level where everyone accepts and appreciates the work from home model. In fact, we did a recent survey where we asked our member companies what percentage worked from home prior to COVID, and what percentage of your employees do you expect to continue working from home post this crisis? The numbers were quite interesting. 40% on average work from home or had work from home capability prior to the crisis. 18 to 100% will continue working from home now and into the foreseeable future. That's a significant change. And I think that's going to impact quite significantly on the way in which people move in and out of the city. And potentially bodes quite well for alleviating traffic congestion, because suddenly you have the notion of a peak hour is not that powerful anymore. And the need to be in a particular physical location in order to work is not that important anymore. And I think that potentially bodes quite well for the future.
Ryan, there actually are two projects which come to mind, or two projects we're involved in. The first is the City of Cape Town's cycling strategy, which when we commented out, I don't know if Gail Jennings is here, but we'd gotten lots of inputs from different people. But at the time, it wasn't really a strategy. It was more of an outline. So they had this goal of 8% of transport trips. So a bit of advocacy work there in saying, well, look, this is not really a strategy. There's kind of a goal, and then there is lots of ideas, but it's not like strategy, tactics, operations. Who does what, when do they do it? And the second, if I share my screen, is actually the irony is that was commissioned by the private sector. So in Durban, Urban Lime was looking into walkability, and we came up with this concept of the big O, which I think you were speaking about in terms of connecting different precincts in different areas, and not just building infrastructure just for the sake of having it. And what we found was that you could actually, if you could identify which of the routes of the inner city from the waterfront to the stadium were great. So the promenade in Durban, fantastic. Probably need some activation at night. And this is on the east of this graphic. And in Durban CBD, for example, there's almost no human scale. It's 6 lanes one way, 4 lanes the other way. So you've got these routes with great potential just to clip on gigantic pavements, because it's very well used and very vibrant. So a lot of people moving through. And then down to Florida Road, right at the top, number 1, where it's already quite walkable and quite accessible. What I think the main sort of bit of work, which we never really got to get into, was that walkability wasn't just about the quality of infrastructure. So across the world, they've got these walkability rankings and metrics, which range from 0 to 100. So 65 and is less walkable than 78. And what we found that in South Africa's context, that there were a bunch of what we call primary indicators. So there were things you had to answer basically yes to before you could even start to measure the quality of connectivity and comfort and infrastructure. So we see this in the reasons why people run across freeways and don't use bridges, because if your answer to the safety of that route, despite it being a beautifully engineered bridge, is no, it's not safe enough, it's not worth the risk. It doesn't matter how beautiful and shaded and how many seating options there are on that route, you're not going to cross that bridge. If there's no culture of walking, if it's physically impossible to walk. So there were a number of what we called yes or no questions, and if any of them were no, people wouldn't walk. So it simply wasn't walkable. And then we went into what we call, I suppose, secondary indicators, which is what people know best, which is, is it comfortable and convivial? And there you could sort of range between 0 and 100, that this route was it's probably better to walk down Long Market than it is to walk down, than let's say Wales Street, because the pavements are a bit narrow. But if you don't answer yes to all of these questions, you're just not gonna, it doesn't really matter if you don't address these aspects of safety. Maybe an example is let's say St. George's Mall at night in the Cape Town CBD, probably very good infrastructure, really walkable. There's no risk of, but whether or not you walk the 6 blocks down St. George's Mall at like 9 p.m. at night to dinner is another question. Maybe it's lighting, maybe it's, so it's walkable in theory and by engineering terms, but it's missing all the other elements, which are what we call these binary indicators and these yes/no questions. Faldi, I'd like to switch to you. Faldi is our from Madison Consulting Engineers. Is the one that takes all the fire from the urbanists about engineers messing up cities. But maybe Faldi, before we chat about mobility accessibility, I always ask myself why you included our future cities in the leadership of our foreshore bid. I know you talk about being visionary, but maybe let's just start there. It was Steve and yourself, Khali Jacobs and Guy Briggs, so great urban designers, engineers, and specialists. And then Faldi said, why don't you join us? So maybe just take us through your rationale for that.
Yeah, no, we were kind of looking for, I mean, you started the discussion with Steve about modeling and kind of more the engineering side of things, or the technical side of things, and we ended up all in the same room, all these technocrats, whether he was a Khalid or myself or Steve, we had a certain way of kind of being trained, as built environment professionals, and we kind of needed something different. And I still, on all of our projects, the first person I look for is you, purely because, it allows us to kind of think a bit different about a project. So, I mean, on the foreshore freeway, I mean, the whole concept there was, do you keep the freeway or do we remove it? And before we could kind of go into the technical side as to why keep it, why remove it, I think you were one of the first guys to say, just take it away and see what happens. What are the kind of implications of taking it away? And particularly about the idea of reconnecting the CBD to the sea, which, to a large extent in Cape Town isn't there, when in fact, it's literally, stone throw away on the other side of the freeway. So I, we kind of, we like that kind of lateral thinking. And that's the reason why we kind of involved you on that project. And I know, I mean, Steve will tell you, the idea of even thinking with the city closing a particular road, and we literally, as part of that concept, said, close Bree Street to traffic. What is the effect of it? I mean, that, if you go into the city with that kind of concept, close Bree Street to traffic. There are all kinds of reasons as to why not to do it. But the nice thing about working with you was kind of close it and then see what the effect is. And I suppose COVID's taught us that. I mean, we've kind of we had to kind of be in a particular situation and we say, well, cool. Well, no, we all work from home, and we don't have to simulate that. It kind of just happens, right? And then it didn't turn out that bad, what I'm saying? As Ryan was saying, we kind of probably more positives than negatives, but could you imagine, 8 months ago saying to guys, listen, you got to work from home, we're going to come up with all kinds of excuses to why not. And this is the same with some of the projects we deal with. I mean, you say, why throw the freeways down? I mean, how's people going to get in? People, particularly on the N1, they're all going to complain. Okay, so you close it and then see what happens.
Yeah.
We did all the simulations afterwards. So, yeah, I mean,
I think it was quite interesting for me, Faldi. Sorry to interrupt you when you said that when we spoke about, putting cars and vehicles and buses on the ground and lifting the city up, you said it's actually, engineering-wise, it's not actually that difficult. Because I remember
No.
the city asking us, well, the city asked us who the civil engineers were. We had like, you know, besides your team of specialists, we had like I think 1 or 2 additional giant firms.
Yeah.
It wasn't an engineering project. To build a little balcony 9 meters above the ground is not actually the most complex thing you've done. You've done much more complex projects, of course.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, you know, nothing's impossible, you know. It's just how much it's going to cost, really. But, you know, and whether, and look, our models for Forshore Freeways, particularly, you know, was based on the rates return that the city would get out of just having, you know, additional accommodation in the city, you know, and that you could pay it off in a space of 9 to 10 years, and you could fund it out of a green bond, you know. I mean, it wasn't that difficult a model to kind of put together, you know. But you need lateral thinking, you know. If you don't think that way, you kind of think, oh, well, you know, how much is it going to cost, not what the return is of an investment over a period of time. Then, you know, it's a little bit more difficult. And unfortunately, that's the way, you know, the city operates at the moment, you know. They want to know how much. It's not what the benefit is overall to society or community or the city as a whole. And that's unfortunately the reality we're having to kind of work with. It just makes it harder, you know, to talk to people, but we get there, you know.
Actually, maybe let me just make a comment on that bold thinking. Recently, well, I say recently in Johannesburg, they were doing some remedial work on the M1, M2 flyover. It's a double bridge, and apparently the engineers were very, very nervous because the city they were proposing to close down that link. For anyone who knows Johannesburg, it's a major connector from southwest up to northeast. It's a huge link, 4 or 5 lanes in both directions, and they were just going to close it down. They were doing some remedial work on the bridge foundations and the footings and the bearings, etc., etc. And the city said, no, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to let the traffic find its way around and find alternative routes. And often, as Foldy was saying, there's a great deal of nervousness out there, and we have to over-engineer or we have to overthink a solution. But actually, traffic and transport and motorists are pretty clever. They'll think their way around it, and it's beginning to prove that we perhaps do not need all of that infrastructure that we suspected that we did.
Yeah, I always think about it. I think I chatted to Ryan about this as well. When we needed, you know, with traffic, you don't need more lanes when you've got the 5 lanes that are empty in the other direction. So I think it's Lisbon or some cities with bi-directional lanes. It's almost a cultural shift which requires us to try different things. We were managing a sort of a walking workshop in Johannesburg for the SA Cities Network last year this time. Getting participants out of a workshop and actually walking them from Constitution Hill to meet various people along the way to talk about their housing and transport projects. And it was quite interesting because the Joburg City Council chambers are incredible and beautiful, but those little connections, you know, like which way you exactly walk from Constitution Hill, you get the council chambers, amazing. Then it's kind of like a zigzag of pedestrian crossings to get to the other side of the road. And Local Studio had done some great work. They're a Joburg firm. They had almost made a bit of what they call a promenade, sort of widened the pavements and added some seating. And it was a bit ironic that with the spend on the Joburg City Council chambers and the prominence of Constitution Hill, a tall building like Braamfontein Gate, and then just beneath that, the Gautrain station and Joburg, and somehow none of that had been properly connected for people walking. So you leave Park Station, the Gautrain, wondering, I mean, you know, possibly getting mugged if you're not careful. And then you don't actually visually see that you're quite close to lots of things that are important. And so we probably had like R1 billion spent on lots of things in that area, but yeah, you know, Local Studio had to come in to do what sort of like a bit of surgery just to make things a bit more, and they actually called it the Rethink Street Promenade because they got to do a bit of improvement on the one side. And I suppose, not to pick on Kubik Interchange, but you know, taxis do stop there. People do have to walk through there to get to train stations, and somehow we're still forgetting to just do a little bit of work, even if it's not R1 billion, but if it's R1 billion spend, possibly we're always having to fight for the majority that are walking and using public transport, for a little bit of spend for the public realm, which does exist. There's a question. Sorry, we only have 10 minutes left for those who have to go. How do the panelists see? We don't actually have panelists, but how do those that are answering questions see micromobility, so scooters and bike sharing, fitting into existing transport and mobility infrastructure in African cities? And I'm always wondering for our panelists, don't they just fit themselves in? I don't know who wants to chat about scooters.
Look, there's one thing I wanted to kind of just mention, the work we did on the C40 competition. Unfortunately, we can't share too much of it because it's still under review with the city. And one of the projects we tackled was a place called Captain's Cliff, which is the last station in Mitchell's Plain before you get to Manandi Beach. And I kind of wrote a whole bunch of
I'm tempted to share a picture.
Oh, are you going to share? Okay.
But I won't.
One of the things that I wrote a whole long thing about scooters and bikes and micromobility, and Steve kind of said, do you think that we're going to have a lot of that at Captain's Cliff? You know, we should be kind of looking more at how people walk from one area to the other, because, you know, more than 90% of them won't have a car. And that the area where we needed to design was more to kind of how walkable is it, you know. And so we kind of re-looked at that design concept purely in what, you know, I mean, Paris has kind of started doing that too, you know, where they talk about the 15-minute walking city, you know, so that everything that, you know, is within 15 minutes of where you need to be, and you walk, you know. And I think that's kind of more crucial for us. If I think about how expensive it is to buy a scooter now, it's some 80 grand. I mean, you know, just for something that has a battery on it. You know, we should be walking. Even yesterday when you said, you know, do I need to provide parking? I said, no, I'm going to walk. You know, it's not that far. Just less than 15 minutes.
I actually thought you were at home, Faldi, so that's not nice. Just trying to be nice.
So you know, I mean, the C40 competition, when we kind of looked at that, actually, I think a lot of that was around walkability rather than, you know, scooters and bike sharing and stuff like that. Which I think is important, right? But don't forget, you know, we actually at a level where we've got to make sure that we have safe walking routes. But, you know, people can actually get from one place to the other, and that you provide this infrastructure and facilities within a safe distance for people to walk. So, and I didn't actually answer that question, but I thought we mustn't forget about, you know, that we've got one level down to kind of deal with in African cities, particularly, especially when you know, you're designing something around a station that doesn't work. I mean, it hasn't worked for the last 2 years. There's no, you know, no trains that run from Captain's Cliff. So yeah.
I think there's another question. Sorry, Faldi. There's someone at the raised hand. I think, Tazami, you've been added to the panelists, so you can turn on your video if you wish, or you could just answer your question, ask a question.
While we wait, Rashik, if I can just jump in very quickly.
Yes, go for it, Ryan.
Just in response to Lebo's question. Thanks for that, Lebo. I think there's actually, before I get there, I want to make a point to say, just to support what you guys were saying, that the infrastructure needs to match the way that people organically move, and not vice versa, right? So we've got a lot of really great infrastructure that doesn't get used because people will walk in a particular way, and the infrastructure doesn't support that. So I think that's very important. But the point I want to make about micromobility is, you know, it's more future focused, looking slightly forward, but a significant trend that we've seen is what I've spoken about previously, around companies not needing those big offices, but also a trend towards hopefully decentralization, and rather than this need to move all of these people large distances into a CBD, it's going to be, I think, more a case of smaller journeys to a decentralized node where many companies will have smaller offices and set up things like that. And then I think, scooters, bikes, and that kind of thing for such short distances become far more viable than cars and needing parking and all that kind of stuff. So I do think if you're thinking about from the perspective of needing to move people into a CBD, it's going to be problematic in places like South Africa and Africa. But if you start thinking about what the future might look like and the way companies are increasingly going to start behaving, and you have more decentralization and shorter journeys required, then I think micromobility becomes far more important and far more viable.
Yeah, I think that links into a lot of the approach of some of our work, which is, the future is not necessarily just a 30, 50 year like master planning project. We see it as more as increments. So there's going to be, we all laugh about Uber and we didn't see it coming, or suddenly here and now we're dependent. But there's a lot of that that's about to arrive. And I think the swear word of decentralization is both office and government decentralization, but also the decentralization of who provides transport, which is the real barrier for South Africa, because the idea that only agencies of government can provide mobility solutions is really, it touches on every sort of nerve of the political set, despite the National Land Transport Act talking about devolution. But I think it's more than devolution. It's about who can provide a transport service. Can Nelson Mandela Bay give a 30-year concession on its roads for light rail and not have to put any money into the whole project? And I think that, micromobility, are we going to license them to death and then actually just have no micromobility options because you need to, there are only 1,500 scooters allowed and none of them can deliver anything because they need to be licensed by 12,000 authorities. So I think there are a lot of questions within your questions. But Tozama has, I think we have a few minutes left. Tozama says walkability is such an interesting topic. Also walking for leisure, running routes, can this be incorporated into urban fabric? I think running routes are probably, I think there are different ways to almost invent infrastructure. And sometimes you put a park run somewhere and suddenly there's infrastructure, or suddenly it's a route because people are running it. I think people using routes is quite important. In many areas you see desire lines going across a field because the route that was planned formerly by transport planners is not being used to walk to a train station. People cross a field because it's the quickest route. So I think, yes, Tozama, I think that people walking or running, and actually, I think we should start to look into maybe not park run, but moving park runs and walks to events to other areas. And that's why it's important to have the Cape Town Marathon run through certain neighborhoods like Athlone, because the more people break down the mysticism of other neighborhoods and the more they feel comfortable, and the runners will just run anyway. I think the runners are kind of great because they will go, they don't care if it's Cape Point or Fisher or Athlone or Durbanville, they will go anywhere. So I think maybe that strategy is send the runners there and the walking routes will happen. And the same with the city's cycling strategy. Has anybody bought 3,000 bicycles and donated them and seen what's happened? Maybe it's not so much about R1 billion on more cycle routes, but maybe it's 10,000 bicycles for free and seeing who cycles and finds a way to get around. Because the cost that you save in terms of the carbon emissions impact and the cost of one less vehicle or one less person. And then there's also the health benefits of cycling. I think I haven't really tested that on any level. There's I don't think we have more time, so I'm going to end the formal proceedings here at 1 p.m. exactly. We all have other calls to get to. Just thanks to everyone. We can be here for 5 more hours, but the idea is that we throw around ideas and reflections in this hour. We touch base in various ways in the future. Next week, Siska, I think I have to be reminded the topic for next week. Next week, we're looking at precincts and housing. And again, these are all quite interconnected. So I think we've seen today that, you know, technology and micromobility and public spaces are linked to walkability and accessibility. And then just a mention of, we should try to look into the research of his left, but Sean Cook, who's looking at accessibility in terms of obviously both, you know, do you put the hospital where people are? Do you put hospitals in a center where people have to travel to? Or do you provide virtual medical care where anybody actually is? And so he's really, instead of modeling the success and viability of BRT routes, I think it was also through the project office where we asked R1 billion for a transport route or R1 billion of housing in the city center. Because there's some real questions about, you know, where you put things. And now with not the rise, but these virtual lives that we live as well. Again, are we asking the right question about the future? And instead of just putting down lots of infrastructure and hoping that people go there. So thanks to everyone. Sorry that we have to run off again. Those that wish to stay, I think our host, my colleague Emmanuel, will keep the Zoom running for a while. I have to go to another call, but have a great weekend and thanks so much for your time.
Thanks to you. Thanks for putting us all together. Okay, cheers guys.
Thanks Ryan, thanks Ollie.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. Thanks to everyone on Facebook, Instagram, and the attendees. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Cheers now.